Welcome to SPAN. Welcome to SPAN. My name is Mark Davis. I'm with the D.A. Davidson Trust Company in Seattle, and I'm honored to be this year's president of SPAN. Thank you all for coming. There's a number of people that have not been to SPAN before, and you know who you are. There's actually 17 people that haven't been. So if you would please stand, if this is your first time at SPAN, we'll recognize you. Please stand. And for those of you that have not been to SPAN, we do things a little different. We actually have a conversation before we serve lunch. So lunch is served after the conversation. So please enjoy your salads and rolls at the table. And then during the conversation after the conversation, we will have a discussion at the table that is led by a table captain. So at each table, there is an experienced table captain. So if you'd please raise your hand if you're a table captain. Looks like we got all the tables covered. I see a roving hand over there. Very good. And these people are really experienced at how the conversation goes because we're trying to learn best as advisors what we can learn from today's conversation with Colleen and Beth. So we learn today, and then we take that along to our table discussion and then talk about that, so as well as what you do in your profession. So there will be a table captain monitoring that, and it's a lot of fun. They're experienced at what they do. So next I'd like to recognize the sponsors of this year's programming at SPAN. And without our sponsors, we really couldn't accomplish what we do. So there's two gold sponsors, Bloodwork Northwest, D.A. Davidson Trust Company. Silver sponsors, we have Bader Martin, Clark Nuber, Columbia Bank, Del Prado Advisory Services, Ernst & Young, Filament, Fulcrum Capital, Goldman Sachs, Helsel Fetterman, Pratt Legacy Advisors, Children's Hospital, U.S. Bank Wealth Management, and Whittier Trust. Well, please give our sponsors a big round of applause. And if you're interested in sponsoring, please let me know. Next, I will introduce our discussion leader today, Lorraine Del Prado, who will then introduce our panelists. So it's a good time to come up. Lorraine Del Prado, for more than 25 years, has led fund development programs that expanded philanthropic base of organizations and has raised, why don't you all come up? Yeah. Raised over, well, actually hundreds of millions of dollars through outright gifts as well as legacy gifts. In addition, why don't we have Ann come up? In addition to many board affiliations, she is founder and president of Leave 10, which is an organization that encourages people to at least leave 10% of their net worth and their legacy to charity, and founding board member of SPAN. Please welcome Colleen, Ann, Beth, and Lorraine to SPAN.
Can you hear me? Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Now, we have been conducting these conversations for 10 years. And in the past 10 years, we have featured philanthropists who have gained enormous financial success and wanted to translate or convert those considerable resources into a benefit for humanity in very impactful and strategic ways. And while most of us, and perhaps most of our clients, will not quite reach that level of success or impact, we've been able to gain a lot from their principles and lessons and applied those to our own personal giving plans and also to the plans of our clients. So in this particular conversation, we will be exploring how people who are really engaged in the community and are very civic conscious, but do not have quite the same level of net worth, can still be extremely impactful and strategic through collective grant making. And we will specifically explore the power of collective grant-making among women. Now, we already know that women in all income levels actually give twice as much as men to charitable organizations. And 70% of the largest wealth transfer that has started to happen is actually going to be inherited by women. So just imagine what would happen if we could unleash that philanthropic power for community transformation. And that is part of the story that will be told by these super women that we have here today. And we had introduced you to them in our announcements of this program, but just very briefly, I'm very privileged to be here with Colleen Willoughby, who is the founder of the Washington Women's Foundation, and actually really started this whole movement of women's collective giving, collective grant making. And she's also the founder of Catalyst, because it has become a national movement. And she'll tell you more about that organization that will be here in February and representing a lot of these women's giving circles around the country. And with us today, too, is the co-founder of Washington Women's Foundation, Ann Farrell. And as we know, also is the president emeritus of the Seattle Foundation and has been a board member of a lot of outstanding organizations here in Seattle. And lastly, we have Beth McCaw, who is the current president and CEO of Washington Women's Foundation, and whom we unfortunately lost to the estate planning profession, because she was quite a star estate planning attorney, but we've gained an extraordinary philanthropic leader when she retired from law practice 10 years ago, right? Okay, so thank you again for joining us. So let me start with Colleen. So Colleen, take us back, was it 23, 25 years ago, when you started thinking about collective giving involving women. What inspired and motivated you to do that? Where were you in your life when you were thinking about that? And who are your allies in really establishing this movement?
I'm unaccustomed as I am to public speaking with microphones. Is this working? Thank you, Lorraine, for inviting the three of us. We all are woofers, as I like to call us, the Washington Women's Foundation women, from the very beginning to the very current with Beth here. But you did ask me to say, where was I in my journey and what happened? I would like to say that the title of your program, The Power of Women's Collective Giving, I would say the power of philanthropy is in this room. And that is all of us together. So however you structure yourself being together, together is better. So keep doing it. I graduated from college many years ago and was a volunteer in my first career, I guess you would say it. That was what women did. I often feel like I'm a product of my generation. But I served as a volunteer on many organizations, was president of some, the Seattle Children's Home, the first place that I had ever volunteered as a teenager, the United Way, Planned Parenthood. And what I learned in being a board member and a volunteer was the fragility of the funding mechanism that kept those nonprofit organizations alive. I was very experienced at being a contributor and serving on the board, but as a real donor and investor, that was new to me. There was another thing happening at that time, and that was just the whole women's movement, where we went from being just the secondary positions in organizations to really managing and being presidents of organizations and leading them. And it also meant that the wealth, it was different from when I began teaching as a professional while my husband was at law school, and where the women were in 1995. So I felt that my experience as a volunteer in nonprofit organizations is both time and talent wasn't moving the needle. And I think women were beginning to be leaders in their communities, and money was the power tool. Well, you don't know how to use big money unless you learn how to use it. So that's really, I've always thought of Washington Women's Foundation as being the training wheels for women as philanthropists, and you're all here in this room today. So that is kind of where I was and how Washington Women's Foundation began, and it has been growing ever since. I would love some questions.
So who were your allies? There were, which other friends of yours did you invite to join you in this journey?
There were five. There were five of us, and they were all very experienced women in philanthropy, and being one of them right here, who was the president of the Seattle Foundation at the time. I think you were president at the time. Faye Sarkowski, they're all names that you recognize. She was very active in the cultural arts community and president of Poncho and various other things. Sue Lyle, now Hunter, was very active at Children's Hospital and was the chairman of the board of Children's Hospital. And Rhoda Altum, who was our young member, we were more the same age at that time, and she had been president of the YWCA. So these were five women that had been in the trenches of the nonprofit organizations and led them, and were also very aware that money really is the power tool, and philanthropy is the big ingredient that really makes organizations run. So the five of us really were the head start of Washington Women's Foundation, and that's kind of, they were our allies. We were all allies.
Well, the next question would be to one of those women. And so at the time that the Washington Women's Foundation was established, you were the president of the Seattle Foundation. As you were building the Women's Collective Giving model, which of those best practices actually emerged from the Seattle Foundation, and which ones were uniquely developed because you wanted to really engage women more powerfully?
Well, the assumption, oh, sorry.
It's working.
It's just
In the
on.
front.
Oh,
Yes,
hello.
there you go.
Sorry. The Seattle Foundation, of course, was not a men's organization. I was the first woman to chair, or to be the president and CEO of the organization, but women were on the board, women served on their committees, women were donors, and had family funds with the foundation. So we were not introducing women to philanthropy. They were already there. The question, I think, as it reflects on the time and then later the Washington Women's Foundation, is that women were less confident, I think, of their own abilities to manage money, make money, give money away. It was an area that was left often to the men in the family, maybe with women giving a nudge, maybe them giving advice, but seldom taking the leading roles. And I give the Seattle Foundation credit for the fact that even long before I was there were women on that board and chairing their committees, and they were actively involved. One thing I did notice in the early days at the foundation was that often the women deferred to the men in their families as to where the money would be given and what would be supported. I use as an example a man who was a Yale graduate, and there was a lot of money in that family, and when he died, most of that money went to Yale, in spite of the fact that she too had been at one of the women's colleges in the East, just as an example. And it wasn't that he had left it to Yale, it's that she gave it to Yale. And I thought that was telling at the time, and I think I get a few nods around the room on the fact that that was, we're now talking in the early 80s. So time goes along, and pretty soon you begin, and maybe those of you who are advisors in the room begin to see that the women are taking a bigger role in in the functioning of their private foundations or in their donor-advised funds. And I think that that's historic in a way. More women are working at professional levels. More women are educated in finance and pay attention to that, which was not necessarily true in the early 80s. And they are community leaders in ways that I think women have always had leadership roles in the community, but there are more of them, and they're more willing to be forceful about it. So that brings us to today, and I'll let you ask another question.
Oh, sure.
Lorraine,
Yes.
I'd like to, if I may.
Yes,
can we do
please,
this
yes.
sort of add to what Ann was saying, that the design, I didn't mention, the design of Washington Women's Foundation has always been a high level. In other words, we decided that the grants were going to be $100,000. And in 25 years ago, or almost 25, that was not necessarily, as Ann's just been saying, that generally it was the men of the family that were dealing with those kinds of numbers. So that was a very deliberate design on our behalf, that we said their grants were going to be $100,000. The membership grew. We all agreed that if we can attract 100 women in the beginning to go for this sort of thing, it was a go. Well, we did that in about 5 months, so it was a go, and we made our first $100,000 grant that was in October, and I think it was in May that we were to be able to make our very first grant. I was just saying to Mark the other day, I think it's very prophetic that grant went to MAVIA, which is Mothers Against Violence in America. And I think of the conversation that's going on today, that was really foresighted. But the level of giving was set at a high bar with the expectation that women could move to it. And I think that was exciting.
I'll embellish on that just a little bit. In the early days, we were still sort of, I guess, trying to lead women to think on those terms of the bigger grants and the ability to move the needle for an organization that was ready to have that kind of financial backing. Our own members were more timid about that than Colleen and I and our other compatriots. For instance, we would get presentations from a number of different organizations, all asking to be the donor of or the recipient of the year, so to speak. And many of the women had the idea, well, $100,000 is great, but maybe we should just give each of them $20,000. Wouldn't that just be fair? Wouldn't that just be nice? And it took Colleen and me and the other three some talking to convince people that it was important to make the choice, back the energy that was behind these changes that were coming along, and to sort of have the tough skin to say we can't fund them all, we're going to fund the 5 that meet our criteria. And it took a while to get that idea fully across, I think.
But there was something else that was unique to Washington Women's Foundation that was not, pardon us for maybe disobeying your rule. We've been friends for quite a long time. You don't just write checks in philanthropy. I think one of the most interesting, one of the best qualities, and continues under Beth's leadership, of the Washington Women's Foundation, that we have a very heavy educational curriculum for our members. In fact, when I go around, when you mentioned the Catalyst organization, there are about 65 funds in that organization now, but none of them have the education component that Washington Women's Foundation continues to have. So it's an educated response to a community, either a request or just an interest that members have that want to pursue it for grant making. And I would say from my own experience, I served on Ann's board for 10 years and also served on the advised fund committee, isn't that what you call it? The grants committee, the advised fund grants committee. So I learned that even the Seattle Foundation doesn't just give money away, but those members that have money placed in the Seattle Foundation do training, and they do make their decisions very carefully about that. So between having chaired the board of the United Way, where it's an employee thing, and it's just, that's another story. There were very few women involved in the United Way when I was there. That changed. But it's thoughtful giving and giving in a major way that, and the education is really a critical part of it.
While we're in that train of thought, I thought it would be great for you to also share the impact assessment committee, which you added to the whole model of collective grant making. Well, would you like to talk about that, Anne?
I'd be more than happy to talk about it because I think that to this day, the way the Washington Women's Foundation does impact assessment is far and away better than many of the huge foundations that we all know around the country, like Pew and others. They make an effort sometimes, and it's more window dressing than true to do the assessment at the end. And Washington Women's Foundation not only has a committee of experienced people, but on it we have other nonprofit leaders who look at these grants and look at the outcomes with clear eyes. And sometimes in the middle of a grant, it will turn out to be that some of them go for 3 years. $100,000 can be done over 3 years. And Beth can talk about how it is today, because I'm not sure I'm totally up to date. But the point of it is that in the middle of a grant, particularly if it's something that is a change agent type grant, you're going to find that maybe something isn't working or that you ought to change it to a different focus. And they can come to the impact assessment people and talk about whether or not the absolute to the penny agreement that was made in the beginning is still the wise track. And I think that flexibility speaks big, big volumes for the effect and the success of the Washington Women's Foundation. Those grants do encourage people to think broadly, start small, think big, grow fast. And we were helpful in that we didn't hold them to the original format.
Well, and there's one other, I'll stop after one thing. Because the whole process that we're talking about here is possible for everyone in this room. In other words, philanthropy really through the Washington Women's Foundation is trying to develop individual women as their own philanthropists. And I think that we have done a remarkable job in claiming that the women are confident philanthropists when they have been members of this organization. And the most recent example of that I'm so happy to talk about because it's on Lopez Island. And one of our members, we happen to have a small place out there and go frequently, but this other woman does too. And she has just single-handedly built a new family resource center and fitness center on Lopez Island. And I said, Pamela, who helped you? And she really is the sole person, having been a very loyal and wonderful Washington Women's Foundation member for years and years. But when you go up to Lopez Island, check it out. It's a fabulous contribution to the community. And she had the confidence to do it. And that's where I think it all comes from.
Thank you. Let's now start at Beth. Beth, you joined Washington Women's Foundation 10 years ago when you retired from law practice. How has your involvement there helped you develop as a community leader and as a philanthropist? And also for the benefit of these advisors, what have you learned through your involvement with Washington Women's Foundation that if you would go back to those days advising individuals in their philanthropy, you would do differently? Yeah.
Sure. So I was very fortunate that Jane Searing, who's here today, introduced me to Washington Women's Foundation many years before I decided to unwind my law practice. And so when I knew I was about to retire, I realized that because I had moved to Seattle from Atlanta as a professional, the only friends that I had in Seattle were you guys. I mean, literally, my personal and professional lives were so intertwined that I realized if I didn't want to be lonely, I had to find some new friends. And so I was interested in a group that was committed to lifelong learning, that was committed to the community, and that was a group of women that were very different, that had different backgrounds, different life experiences, different professions, and so it was a great way for me to figure out who I was going to hang out with after you kicked me out of all your groups like SPAN. So from that, it was a real win. But I realized that philanthropy, any sort of giving, it is a lifelong learning journey, and I feel like the choices that I make now, the choices that my husband and I make now in our own personal philanthropy have definitely been informed by the experiences that I've had the opportunity to be a part of through Washington Women's Foundation. And I think as a leader of this organization, also being committed to carrying on the legacy that Colleen and Ann established for us, really being on the cutting edge of women's philanthropy back 25 years ago, and really pushing our organization to say, where does philanthropy need to go? What does philanthropy need to be? And so as we're about to celebrate our 25th anniversary next year in 2020, it's really looking forward to how does philanthropy need to show up in the community in the future.
And from what you've learned, if you were to do things differently as an advisor, what would you say you would have done differently now that you've been at the Washington Women's Foundation for 10 years?
Well, I think it's interesting that philanthropy is very risk adverse, right? And we have to be spot on with all of our funding choices. And I think through our impact assessment process at Washington Women's Foundation, we've given ourselves the grace to not make it right every single time. I mean, I think about my husband comes to me, he's like, hey, a buddy wants us to invest in a startup company, and I'm like, okay, there goes charity. But I mean, I just think it's so interesting how if you're a venture capitalist and you, at 1 out of 100 investments is a home run, like you're brilliant. But if you're investing as a philanthropist in the community, if you make one mistake, you're an idiot. So I think we completely have to turn that narrative on its head, and we have to be willing to take more risks, because these are not, we're not just selling widgets, right? We're solving poverty, we're addressing affordable housing. These are big issues. And so I feel like we've got to be willing to throw big resources at these problems as well, and be willing to take big risks and make big mistakes, because that's the only, I tell my 12-year-old daughter, mommy fails at least once every single day, and it's intentional, because that's the only time I'm learning and really stretching myself as an individual. So I feel like as a sector, philanthropy could do a lot more in risk-taking. I also feel like we've let the IRS kind of push us into our place. Where the 5% payout from family foundations is now the ceiling and not the floor. So we have so much capital, and I know you all are investing it. Thank you. That's good. Keep it up. But there's so much money tied up in endowments sitting on the shelf, and some of our communities are literally burning right now. So if we aren't willing to unleash some of that capital and put it to work today, it's kind of like, why am I holding on to this endowment? My daughter and I may not, both of us, be around to enjoy it because of what's going on with climate, with our communities. So it kind of now's the time. So I would encourage you, as you're meeting with your clients, to say, is this really the best that we can do? Is this really the most that we can do this year? And what's a 5-year plan? I was always really encouraged by my clients who really didn't look at their family foundations as their legacy. They were willing to spend it during their lifetimes, and in some ways not saddle their children with the burden. Let their children have their own vision for the future and their own vehicles for doing good in the community, but really thinking about what do we want to accomplish in our lifetimes, maybe involving the kids, but to be willing to say we're going to spend it all before we go, or we're going to make sure that it's spent shortly after our estates wrap up. So I think just continuously having those conversations with your clients, checking in to say, really what is your plan? And is it a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan, a 20-year plan? And if we don't really move the needle on some of these issues today, then what's the point of being here 20 years from now? So you'll say it much more nicely than that.
That's a nice thing about you being released from this profession. There's been a courage and a boldness that has been engendered.
It's not like I really held my tongue before. I was just aware that my clients paid me by the word, so I was trying not to rack up the bills.
Let's go back to you, Anne. So there have been so many changes that the world has undergone in the 23 years since the Washington Women's Foundation was founded. So how did the foundation respond to these changes, and what are important trends that you see in the future?
Ooh, I don't remember that being on my list of questions, so I'm going to make it up as I go along. Certainly, the women that belong to the organization today are far more educated financially than those who joined us in the beginning. And so they come to us with an understanding of the management of money. They understand us, in many cases, of what it takes to make the money, because they are, in fact, involved with that. And then, too, there's just been a lot of good examples in the community of women leadership, and so they follow that leadership and are becoming leaders in their own right. So they're a different crowd than joined us 25 years ago. Some of them are the same women, but they've grown with the times, so to speak. So that's one big change. The foundation itself, I think, has probably honed some of the rules and regulations that we set up in the beginning. For instance, we have a grants committee that's huge. There might be, you tell me, Beth, but how many are on right now?
Close to 70.
Yeah, 70 women on the grants committee. Now, that's a lot of people. And so how do you disperse that women power around the community to learn where the important needs reside and who can solve them or attempt to solve them? So the education part that Colleen was speaking is part of the grants process is educating those 70 women to be aware of the needs in the community and to be able to sort through numerous requests. Again, I'll turn to Beth, but you're getting a couple hundred requests a year.
Oh, yeah, close to 400
Yeah.
from statewide.
Yeah, it is a statewide effort on our part, and we have women who are members around the state, not great numbers of them, but that was one of our ideas in the beginning, is that it might evolve further in the state than it has to date. So scale is huge. Education is huge, and it comes at these women from different places. Some of them, they bring that education to us, and sometimes they're learning from the foundation. The nonprofit organizations themselves are far more savvy than they used to be. Their leadership is smarter. They're more strategic in the way they plan their future, and what kinds of grants that they bring to us are far more strategic than the early ones. So it's a joint effort across the community. And I don't think Washington Women's Foundation is the only place that is experiencing this. And we'll take a lot of credit for some of it. But you know, the donors, thanks to all of you who are helpful in that respect, are getting more savvy all the time as well.
And I would say this is a different organization than it was 25 years ago, because Seattle and this metropolitan area has changed. And so whereas that first 100 women knew each other really well from many different areas of their lives, we're finding women who are new to the Seattle area are finding Washington Women's Foundation as a place to learn about the community. They may be fairly experienced philanthropists. They may have been very involved in the communities they lived in before, but they just don't know this area. And so we're a great place if you have clients that are new to town and are looking for a way to get to know the community and to engage. We're a great on-ramp for that. I mean, we certainly do have members, too, that have gone on to create donor-advised funds and family foundations, but they still continue to be part of Washington Women's Foundation because of that vast number of organizations that are applying to us for funding every year. So again, it's a way that they see they can continue learning more about the community and bringing it back to use that knowledge in deploying philanthropy. We're also seeing a new trend in that women are not just interested in deploying their resources in the 501c3 public charity space, and so a lot of the educational opportunities we've had now are really talking about what is the role of a 501c4 organization? How do you get involved in supporting political candidates, even though as a public charity, that's not what Washington Women's Foundation can do. But I think especially since the 2016 election, women are saying, there are multiple ways that I can deploy my resources. It doesn't have to be strictly in the public charity 501c3 space. So I really want to learn about all the different places that I can kind of put my voice. So definitely more thinking of ourselves as donor activists than just strictly donors, and then all the different ways that we can help leverage resources.
So Beth, you've been the CEO of Washington Women's Foundation for 4 years now, and you saw also a tremendous need for some changes so that the Washington Women's Foundation could be more responsive to what you've been seeing in the environment. So if you can just share with the audience what has been happening with that transformation, how you were able to invite different stakeholders, and the earliest manifestations of this new grant-making criteria that we just implemented this year.
Well, I think because, as Ann and Colleen have mentioned, 25 years ago, some of you were talking to women about wealth, but not all of you were, because I was in law school, and I know that. I would have some clients in Georgia, which wasn't a community property state, and I would tell a husband he should give some of his assets to his wife so we could maximize, their, nice idea, little lady, that's never gonna fly, So thank you for having those conversations with women, because early on, we had very broad funding criteria because that was seen as a way to really center the educational needs of our women member donors. And so that was very much a focus of us. This whole curriculum and our whole grant-making process was really an educational tool for budding women philanthropists. Since that time, women are so much more sophisticated. You're advising women in more sophisticated ways. And so we really took a look at centering the needs of the community in the grant making that we do. And that caused us to revise our grant making criteria. And we used a community involved process where we were actually, not only our members were involved, but local nonprofit leaders were involved, and other funders from the Casey Foundation to Medina to Satterberg helped us craft our new criteria. But early on, our board said, what is the most pressing issue facing communities throughout Washington State? And we said it was a lack of equity. And so now our grant criteria are just straight on focused on racial and gender-based equity. And so that has been a tremendous change for us, but it meant from top to bottom, we had to change everything from our curriculum to our letter of inquiry to our proposal, everything we do. And we have 4 staff members. So I say we're like the puffer fish, we look kind of average, but then we can really blow up and accomplish a lot when needed. But I feel really lucky, too, that there are about 450 women who are part of Washington Women's Foundation, some of whom are here today, that helped us. And also some of your firms, from Laird Norton to KeyBank to Clark Newberg, JP Morgan Chase. There have been so many of you all in the community who have financially supported our educational efforts as well. So we value your partnership and value everything that you've contributed to help us get to this new place for our grant making and service of the community.
Thank you. I know we could go on and on with this conversation, but there are people in our audience who would like to ask a few questions.
I'll ask one. So you have 500 members, correct? And on average, you give each one at least gives $5,000 a year. 2,500. Somehow I thought 5,000. I rounded up. So you're bringing in about $1 million to a year or so. Is that correct? And you give 5 main gifts of $100,000. Okay. Just wanted to clarify that for everybody.
Up until this current year, when a member made a $2,500 annual contribution to the foundation, $1,000 went into the pooled fund, which we used to make the 5 $100,000 grants. We just awarded them last week at Benaroya Hall. The second $1,000 went into a mini donor advised fund that we managed, and a member could make 2 $500 grants or one $1,000 grant out during the course of 12 months. And then we kept $500 in the foundation to pay for operations. So it was a kind of every donation was a restricted gift to us. This year, getting ready, because in this year, we're actually building the pool from which we'll make grants next year, 2020, our 25th anniversary. We asked our members to basically go all in and make a $2,500 unrestricted gift to the foundation so that we can see what we can do collectively next year. So we were actually granting close to $1 million out each year, $500,000 collectively, and $500,000 from our individual members making their individual grants throughout the United States.
Yes, and you have a question?
How does the organization decide where they want to have the money go to each year?
So every single, so how does the organization decide where the money will go? And so every single woman who invests in the foundation gets a vote. And so it's a one woman, one vote democratic process. So the 70 women on the grants committee are whittling down the letters of inquiry we get to a top 10. So we have 5 funding areas. There are 2 organizations in each of the 5 categories that go out to the membership in an electronic ballot, and everyone votes. And so that's how the decision is made.
Thanks, Mark. So a question, you said that the non-for-profits have gotten more sophisticated over the years. And I'm curious, as you review grant requests, have you seen a change in how they come in? Specifically, have you seen the not-for-profits become more collaborative in their efforts if they're trying to tackle the same issue?
So yes and no, and I think philanthropy is to fault for the no, because it's very hard to build a coalition or create a true partnership when funders don't want to fund the staffing for that. So a lot of it is because there are not many resources going to actually hold together effective coalitions of organizations. And so until funders are willing to recognize that's an important thing to fund, I don't think it will happen. I think where Ann and Colleen were really brilliant is that Washington Women's Foundation is still one of the few institutional funders in Washington State that gives general unrestricted operating support. And so we're basically saying to the community, we trust you. We may have the financial resources, but you have all the intellectual resources, and you're actually doing the work. And so we try to be really open to hearing what the community needs and how they need to use the funds rather than dictating to them, basically, we've got a brilliant idea, we're gonna fund you to implement it. We take a very different approach. You've got the brilliant ideas, and we're happy to fund it. One of our members said, yes, here's how we fund. You've got a car. You've driven the car around. You've actually got a map. You know where you want the car to go. You've test driven the car. You just need the gas, and we're the gas, right? So you know what type of car you need. You know where you need it to go. You've got the map to get there. We just give you the gas.
I think you
for
can
it.
reveal the name of that member because she's a
that's
SPAN
Sandra
member.
Perkins. She's a SPAN member, I think.
Well, obviously, this could go on much longer, but I hear some clanking of lunch starting to get going here. So please welcome back to SPAN, Beth, Colleen, and Ann, and Lorraine, as I know they will be back again soon. Thank you very much.